Hello, everyone. And yes, I'm going to have to buy a new wardrobe pretty soon. I'm losing enough weight that all of my shirts are massively huge on me now. So they look all wrinkly, but that's a good problem to have. Um, for this video, I wanted to piggyback off my last video dealing with how labels are only meaningful insofar as they reference specific attributes about a thing, and how anti-theists who attempt to equivocate between the concept of God and the concept of the flying spaghetti monster, which again no one believes in. Sorry to all you pastafarians out there. To piggyback off of that, I thought it might be worthwhile to provide a bit more specifically related to Judeo-Christian theism and rationality in general. You see, many atheists or agnostics are fond of saying that religious views are all inherently irrational. That is, to believe in the existence of something supernatural would mean you cannot hold to the validity of logic at all. Now, the first thing that I need to point out is, just as an observation, is that this is a very odd thing for an atheist to assert, especially given that most atheists, at least in the West, those are the ones I'm more familiar with, are materialist or naturalist when it comes to philosophy, which is to say that since they do not believe in the supernatural, the only things that can exist are things within nature itself, within the physical universe. Even counterexamples such as if I say, imagine a red ball. We know that the red ball doesn't exist physically anywhere. It's an immaterial object. But this, we are told by the materialists, is still the result of a purely physical process, our brains. Thus, what appears to be immaterial is really just the outworkings of a material process anyway. So there's nothing that exists separate from what exists materially. Without the material brain, there would be no immaterial red ball that you're imagining. Although, just to be fair here as well, there's quite a bit of agnosticism that comes along with a lot of these views. Most people would probably say it's true that we don't know that there is nothing but the natural world. It's just that only things within the natural world can be known by us. Therefore, if something does exist outside of the natural world, it's inherently unknowable anyway, so it might as well not exist for us. And again, there's a range of beliefs along these lines, so I'm not trying to pigeonhole and say any particular non-theist must believe exactly this, but I think you can still agree that the vast majority of atheists are almost certainly going to be materialists or naturalists of some kind. I'm kind of using materialism and naturalism as roughly equivalent in this. So here in the West, it's not just that they're materialists. It's also that non-theists are going to be proponents of Darwinism. Now, personally, I do believe evolution occurs, but I am not a Darwinist because I do not believe that Darwinism is the mechanism driving evolution. In fact, Darwinism, properly stated, properly defined, really only explains why it is that some species die out. It's the survival of the fittest, which implies the unfit are dying. That's the correlation, right? And that's also where the power of Darwinism comes into play. Darwinism itself, however, says nothing about how these species actually got there in the first place. It only says how they got whittled down. And there are other theories that obviously are glued on to Darwinism now, the most common currently being that it's genetic mutations that create the variety, and then natural selection whittles down after that. And I could get all into that, but that's sort of a side topic to the side topic I'm currently already on. So I don't want to get too far out on there. So setting all of that aside, I still think most of us would agree that if you're a naturalist and you're a materialist, then you have to consider that everything that we hold to today must in some way be linked back to Darwinism, specifically this concept of survival of the fittest. In point of fact, there have been many atheistic philosophers who have tried to demonstrate that things like morality organically arise from within the philosophical underpinnings of Darwinism itself. But here's the point that I want to draw out on that. the main point I'm getting to is if naturalism is true and there is no God at all, then everything that we believe to be true about the world as a whole is inevitably a result of some aspect of survival of the fittest. Now, let me repeat that again with a bit more emphasis, because I'm not saying that everything that exists in the world is inevitably a result of survival of the fittest. That's a given if we're taking naturalism. What I'm saying is that everything we believe about the world is itself also a result of some aspect of survival of the fittest. Not just that the universe is a result of that process, but that because we ourselves are within that same universe that was shaped by Darwinism, that Darwinism itself also fundamentally shaped and guided exactly how we know whatever it is that we do know about the universe. Now, putting this another way, good beliefs that help the species survive are profligated and they remain as cultural norms, whereas bad beliefs that end up in the deaths of lots of people mean that there is no offspring to carry on those beliefs, and as such, bad beliefs will naturally die out. So I mentioned in my previous video that the vast majority of people on Earth are theists of some kind. They believe in some kind of God or gods. This is true not only for today, but throughout all of history. In fact, I can't think of a single people group in history who were known for being atheists. To be sure, there were always atheists within groups of people. There are always some number of atheists, but think about it. The Assyrians had gods. The Egyptians had gods. The Babylonians had gods. The Greeks had gods. The Peloponnesians had gods. When explorers from Europe first got to the New World, they introduced Christianity to the native tribes who were already here in North America, but they didn't have to teach them the concept of theism. And the native tribes already had their religious views here. So theism is not only widespread and popular, but it's virtually universal throughout all of humanity. Now, if naturalism is true, then that level of the spread of this idea seems to imply that there is some kind of survivability advantage to humanity that belief in a deity provides, that lack of such a belief does not provide. Now, clearly, atheism cannot provide a survivability advantage to humanity, or it would have been selected for, and the default would have been atheism, not theism. And here's the problem with that. If naturalism is true, then the belief in God is a false belief. This would mean that Darwinism selected not for truth, not for reality, but Darwinism actually went out of its way to select a lie. People somehow survive better in this universe if they believe something that is objectively false. Now, if your method of explaining how beliefs became widespread is selecting for a falsehood, and that concept of how you select for beliefs came about from the same process that has selected falsehoods before, exactly how can you trust that method to use to determine whether something is true or not? I mean, it would be like this. Let me give an analogy. Suppose that there was an evil wizard and he came through and randomly poisoned half of the apples on Earth. And it's all random. You don't know which one's which. You can't taste the poison. You can't smell it or feel it. None of that. You have no way of detecting what apples are poisoned. You just know that 50% of apples are poisoned and 50% are not. And furthermore, suppose that this evil wizard has taken away all other food supplies. And if you eat an apple, it will take 6 months before you'll die. All other food is gone, so you can't just wait for somebody to test out an apple to see if they live or die, because it will take too long, right? This scenario, we're going to get it as ironclad as we can. So that's the scenario, right? Now, suppose somebody came up to you and says, oh, no problem, I built this machine, and it sorts apples. You put an apple in, it's going to come out into one of two baskets. If it's in this basket, it's poisonous, don't eat it. But if it's in that basket, then it's safe to eat, so go ahead and eat. So you take a bushel, you dump your apples in, and it sorts the apples, and you get roughly a 50-50 mix coming out. So it satisfies the mathematical statistics that you would be expecting. Now, do you eat the apples in the basket that is marked safe Well, let me ask this question in another way. Do you trust that the machine sorted the apples correctly? How can you tell that the apples were sorted correctly or whether it was just random? The only way you can tell if it worked correctly is if you already know which apple is poisoned and which is not, so you can then compare that to the machine and see if it was working correctly. Now, that is the type of problem that we're actually faced with here. When it comes to naturalism, we have a machine that, if naturalism is true, is telling us this fruit is safe to eat, and we know for a fact that it is poisonous, because naturalism is selecting for a default theistic view, which we know that, if naturalism is true, must be a false belief. So again, how can you trust that machine if it's failing at that point? Now, just as the machine analogy presents problems for naturalism if it's rooted, as it is most commonly today, in Darwinism, my own views are going to be stuck with the same question as regards to logic itself. But here's the distinction that I'm wanting to make here. If we take the machine as being our views are formed by Darwinism, then the claim that if we know that that is true gives us results that are false and therefore we can't trust it, makes it illogical to hold to that machine. But if, on the other hand, I propose the claim that the machine is instead the idea that logic itself is capable of determining the validity or invalidity of beliefs, that if we assume that that is true, we necessarily result in needing the existence of something that has the same attributes normally ascribed to God by the majority of Judeo-Christian theists. So again, I'm not claiming that logic will be able to tell us definitively that the God of Christianity or my personal view is true. But what I'm claiming is that logic is going to tell us definitively that if logic is true, then some form of theism must likewise be true. Although saying logic is true is kind of a bit of a bad way of phrasing it. It's more, if logic is valid, then some form of theism must be true. And you can see how that fundamentally is a different claim. Again, if naturalism is true, we've selected for false beliefs. But if my claim that logic is valid means that God necessarily exists, the truth of that claim does not undermine itself. Whereas the claim that naturalism is providing its own self-refutation is a actual problem. So that said, that's going to be what I'm going to attempt to do here. So my own argument is actually going to be very simple. I'm just going to have one axiom. One axiom. That's one thing that you have to assume is true to begin with. Just one thing. And that assumption is logic is valid. We're just going to leave it at that. Now, before we begin, you can feel free to reject that axiom and say that logic isn't valid. But if you do that, you sort of have to give up the claim that theism is irrational. At least if you say that, it doesn't have any merit, because, I mean, if logic isn't valid in the first place, then who cares if something is irrational or not? Or, you might say, well, logic is just a verbal construct. And again, I say, if that is your view of what logic is, then who cares if something is illogical? That wolf has no teeth. Calling someone illogical when you believe that logic is just a verbal construct is hardly worth the effort to say. It's so devoid of meaning. So no, when we're saying something is illogical, we're meaning the type of logic that actually matters. And that's the type of logic I'm saying here in my one assumption, that logic is valid. So if logic is valid, that means that we can use logic to think about certain things. And the first thing that we should think about is the same conclusion that Descartes came to with his whole "I think, therefore I am." But let me demonstrate that in a slightly different manner. Before dealing with thought directly, let me just actually propose an alternative. I will say perception exists. Now, how do I know that? Well, frankly, because I can see things, I can hear things, I can smell them, and taste them, and feel them. Now, note that I'm not saying anything about the validity of what I experience when I say that. We've all seen The Matrix or read about the brain in the vat, or for that matter, we've all had dreams we know that what we experience via our senses may not be accurate at all, but it doesn't matter whether it is or not, because whether our experiences are accurate or not, we still have perception of those experiences. And that's the point I'm making. Now, of course, when I say our, in that I'm making a slight assumption here. Technically, I can only say that I myself have those experiences because I only have access to my own self. I don't have access to you. I don't know whether or not you exist at all. If the world is a deception, I may believe you exist when you don't. Of course, I have no reason to think that that's the case, but it's still a possibility at this point in the argument. But I still know that perception exists even if you don't exist, because I still personally have access to my own perceptions. Everything I believe about myself may be completely false, but something is clearly having perceptions. Because even if everything is a delusion, something must exist in order to experience that delusion, since the delusion is perceived. So for that reason, I would modify Descartes slightly to say, I perceive, therefore I am. So this establishes the fact that something must exist. I call this something I because I am personally experiencing it. For you, when you use this argument, you would refer to the I that is yourself, right? Again, I don't know that you exist, but you can still incorporate this when you're thinking over, and the rest of the argument should still follow. So at this point, we have two things in our toolbox that we can draw from. First, we've assumed by axiom that logic is valid. And now we know that because of perception, something exists. Now, what logically follows from that? It may first think that there's not much you can go from, but I'm going to argue that the existence of anything at all necessarily requires something is self-existent. And what does self-existent mean? It means that the power of existence is within that self. It's something that is not created. In fact, it logically cannot be created. Its power of creation is, well, that's even the wrong way to say it, because we're not talking about self-creation. Self-creation would be illogical, because how do you exist to create yourself unless you already exist to create yourself? So no, we're not talking about self-creation. We're talking about existence. Something must contain the power of existence within itself. It's not dependent on anything else out there. And I argue that the existence of anything requires the existence of something that is self-existent. And the reason I argue that is as follows. So again, I know that I exist because I have perceptions. If I exist, I could already be that self-existent being, which would satisfy the requirement that existence implies something self-existent, right? Or my own existence is derived from the existence of something else, which is much more likely. It certainly is my perception that I have not existed forever. I have memories of being a child, and my memories only go so far back in time. So clearly, my perception is that I am not this self-existent being, but I mean, perhaps I'm mistaken about that. Who knows? At this point in the argument, it still doesn't matter. I perceive that I have had parents, and my parents have told me that they have had parents, right? So there's clearly the possibility that we can go back in time, perhaps billions and billions of years back in time. And that gets to one supposed counter-argument against self-existence. Perhaps there's a infinite regression of existences causing more, and there's no such thing as a first existence that caused all other existences. But instead of having something that's self-existent to kick it off, there's just this infinite regression. But that actually doesn't solve the problem, because if it is true that it is an infinity that goes back, we can describe certain infinities in mathematics in such a manner. And let's just go ahead and say that that is the case for the sake of this argument. In that case, the entire regression, the entire thing itself, needs to be explained. This entire loop of regression upon regression must have either always been there or must have been created by something else. In other words, that loop itself is either self-existent or caused by something else. So we just kick the ball back another level and we're in the same boat again. And it doesn't matter how many times you want to do this inception. It doesn't matter how many levels you want to tap on of these infinite loops of causality. At some point, you either have a structure, even an infinite loop structure, that is self-existence itself, or it's being caused by something else. And that something else either is self-existent or caused by something else. That's the only possible solutions. So, given that, what can we conclude about the nature of whatever this thing is that exists because of self-existence? Well, since our one axiom is that logic is valid, and we're assuming that is true, then whatever this self-existent thing is must exist in such a way to ensure that logic is actually valid. That is, this existence could not exist in such a way where it would create contradictions. This would necessarily require that all that exists because of this existence, because we're talking about the chain of existence going back, all of that exists because of that self-existent thing must exist in such a way that the laws of logic could never be violated. Because any violation of the laws of logic, violated in one spot and the entire chain of logic is broken. If you find some planet in the distant far reaches of the galaxy and contradictions exist on that planet, then the laws of logic are not valid. Logic itself has been overthrown. So, what this means is that this self-existent thing, which we're tying with the domain of logic because it's all intertwined here, it must transcend the entirety of space and time. Which, again, you might be tempted to say, well, maybe it's just the existence of the universe itself. But we know that from the Big Bang Theory, the universe itself has not existed forever. And again, we could say, well, maybe it's part of that same loop. But again, you're still stuck in that. If it is a loop, then that loop itself must be self-existent. We can't escape from that. Something along the line, you're ending up with that self-existence. And if there's a time before the universe, still logic is in place there. Because if we're instead saying that the universe came out of illogic, does it make any sense at all to say that this domain of logic would exist now? And even if it does mean that we have this bubble where logic is valid within this range of chaos, then what difference does it make if something is fine within that? If the reality from which it sprung out of is not logic-based, again, then the statement that something is irrational or illogical is dumb. It doesn't have any teeth at all. So, if logic wasn't valid before the universe began, why would it be valid now? It wouldn't be. It must transcend space and time. It must be eternal. It, too, is eternal. And it is omnipresent because there's nowhere that can possibly exist where logic is invalid. So, simply believing that something exists and believing that logic is valid necessarily requires that we believe that the domain of logic is eternal, transcendent, omnipresent, immutable, because there's never going to be a time when logic is not valid. Again, if it's invalid for a fraction of a second, then it's never valid, right? So this isn't something that's negotiable. And again, you can always feel free to just say, well, we don't care about logic. We can jettison the requirements of logic being valid. And again, that's fine to do, but if your argument is that theism is irrational and that's your view of what logic is, it's a pointless argument. And either way, I would point out that clearly it isn't irrational or against logic for someone to hold to the existence of a being which contains these same attributes which necessarily are derived from simply stipulating that logic is valid. So even if you want to call whatever it is that exists, that's self-existent, that's eternal, transcendent, that's omnipresent, if you want to call that something other than God, you cannot say that somebody who does ascribe that to being God is being illogical from that. On the other hand, if you're a naturalist and you're saying that whatever we know is formed by Darwinism, and we know that Darwinism has chosen for a falsehood in the past, that is irrational. So, with all of that said, I do hope you have a wonderful day.